Let's reveal the answer key, your case study, answer key. A key to a better understanding of the GTR method is here. A key to a better understanding of the GTR method is here. Hello, welcome to your GTR answer key. This time around, we're going to talk about the case study called Marcus Needs to Grieve. To give you a little bit of background here, this was my 6th GTR session with Marcus. And in the previous session, Marcus shared with me the fact that he was rather brutally abused by his father until he was 25 years old. Now, at the time of the session, he's 41. We then worked on a prototype of a memory representing the abuse, but it took another 2 GTR sessions to process everything and finally get Marcus to a place of grief. This study demonstrates how to support your client who finds themselves in the ending stage of a transition. This is where we want to help the client process that grief so that they can ultimately get some closure and move on. One of the things to keep in mind is that there's a difference between sadness that comes from the apathy-like freeze response and the sadness showing you that the client is in the ending zone, that they have entered a transition. So throughout much of this session, Marcus has an overall air of sadness and there's low energy to him. But he's no longer falling into the freeze mode as he did, for example, in the very first session when he realized that his relationship was over. This lower energy isn't a trauma response, but the slowness that is natural when we're moving through apathy and grief, really indicating that the client is ready for a transition. Importantly, Marcus is indeed moving into the transition, into the grief. He naturally felt compelled to write a letter to his abusive father without even me prompting him to do so. On a deeper level, his psyche has already begun processing his profound grief for all the losses that he has suffered growing up in an abusive household. There is power to reflecting back to the client what they've said and to validating their experience. This session gave you several great examples of how crucial this is to reflect the client's own words back to them, both to validate but also to clarify meaning. I read Marcus's letter to his father out loud to him. And this was important to create social engagement and let him feel that his emotions were heard, understood, and validated. Particularly in the case when we're telling brutal truths in our grieving process, the prompts in the therapeutic letter can reveal thoughts and feelings that might be taboo to express. And some clients might feel shame and guilt at even writing those things down. This is a good sign as it means that they're being honest at not repressing what they truly feel. The truth is, we can't genuinely grieve any situation that we're not able to tell the truth about. It's much easier and safer to be seen and validated when we're expressing non-threatening grief than just appears as sadness and mourning. But it's far more difficult to allow someone to see the rawness of a letter like Marcus's, where he says how difficult forgiveness feels, and that he hopes that his father dies in misery and pain after all that he has done. These are feelings that could easily be shamed and dismissed by others. We might perhaps be told to, quote unquote, focus on the positive and to move on. But obviously, this doesn't really work. I tried to normalize these intense feelings for Marcus, the ones that he expressed in his letter, and I expressed how I found this reaction to be fitting for all he experienced. This is particularly vital for someone like Marcus because he tends not to trust his anger given the very unhealthy modeling of this emotion that he received. He represses anger and he fears that he could become like his father if he's not careful. So Marcus needs to hear that these intense feelings towards his father don't make him a monster. They make him human, and they're actually a sign of a healthy reaction to an unhealthy situation. This is not only validating for him, but it's also a part of his learning process to be able to discern healthy responses from the unhealthy ones. In this session, I also tried to get some clarification as to what Marcus meant by the word brutal. It's easy to assume that he meant what he expressed in the letter was brutal. This is what I thought, and this kind of self judgment of his emotion would be expected from Marcus given his relationship to his own anger. The bottom line is the way I would have interpreted the way brutal was far from what Marcus meant by it, as you could see in the session. In other words, what you may consider to be the most logical interpretation of a client's words or impressions may not be what they meant at all. And we can only know for sure if we reflect that back or if we ask. You don't have to do this with all the words that are mentioned in the session. But some of the words, especially the emotionally charged ones, might require you to do that. Let's talk about the link between grief and truth. In both the letter that Marcus wrote and this session in general, Marcus does engage in a lot of truth telling. This highlights how there's a fundamental link between truth and grief, in that we cannot truly grieve something that we cannot tell the truth about. Now, this has to be the genuine, deep in the bones kind of truth with no sugarcoating. Marcus recognizes in this session that the truth about his childhood and all that he lost because of it is brutal. And it's in this place of acknowledging the brutal truth that he's able to truly name his losses. His family is profoundly damaged, and he and his siblings don't talk to one another. He describes them as four damaged people that are living separate lives. This is to be expected with the upbringing he had. The effects of an abusive caregiver are far reaching, and they don't end when the abuse stops or when the abuser is not around anymore. Family members often spend decades dealing with the aftermath. So not only was childhood stolen from Marcus and his siblings, but their adult relationships are now strained as well. Additionally, adults who grew up like this often can't have the kind of deep relationships that they want with their non abusive parent either, because the toll of the abuse affects the parent child relationship too. We can see this in Marcus's description of his mother, a woman who would drink a lot just to cope with the unbearable situation as best as she could, leaving her not fully emotionally available for her children. To top it off, Marcus's mother also died unexpectedly from cancer at a relatively young age. There are so many layers of loss here, and unfortunately for Marcus, he may never develop the relationship he would like to have with his siblings. This will require their own process of truth telling and grief, and people do that in their own time, and sometimes not at all. However painful it is, seeing this clearly is an important part of Marcus's healing. This case study showcases how trauma is so much about not feeling safe in one's own home. Marcus delves deeper into his perpetual feeling of not being safe in his home, whether that's a physical house or an internal sense of being at home with himself. Marcus learned through experience that leaving the family home and even his home country does not necessarily allow to find a safe haven. With a traumatic, abusive history, people carry the instability of their early home lives within themselves, and they tend to recreate the same kinds of situations wherever they are. Marcus realizes that he doesn't have the inner stability that would allow him to have a sense of himself in the world, and he doesn't trust his own perceptions. He's never sure if his emotional responses to situations are normal or acceptable, especially when they involve anger. And this has a major impact on the kinds of relationships that he finds himself in as an adult. The worry that Marcus has about his father lurking inside him does have some truth to it, but not in the way Marcus fears. He's not a monster who harms others, but his father's influence has created a toxic internal landscape that harms him, and it keeps him in a cycle of never being safe or feeling at quote unquote home. In this session, Marcus acknowledges that he's always in situations where he has to pack up and leave, and home always feels insecure, just like it did as he was growing up. He's aware and declares that he wants to break this cycle, which are two very big steps. What do we notice about Marcus in this session? Well, Marcus has rather poor and porous boundaries, and this is a classic symptom of trauma. As Marcus begins to talk about what cycles he wants to put an end to by burying them in a funeral exercise, he brings up the things his exes would do that he cannot understand. For example, manipulating and blackmailing him. This brings to light some helpful information about the internal script that Marcus has about boundaries. We already know that he has trouble with anger, which is an important boundary messenger. And now we also see that deep down, there is a part of him that believes that if he's good, for example, honest about his needs, loving and open, then others should reciprocate his honesty and goodness and should have no reason to mistreat him. Now, healthy people who have our best interest at heart do generally reciprocate this behavior, but without anger alerting him to boundary violations, Marcus tends to be in the company of those who aren't so healthy and who don't always have the best intentions towards him. One of our students said that the people that Marcus tends to surround himself with remind her of boundary destroyers, a concept she read about in a book that she loves. And she said that you can't play by the typical rules of honest communication with someone who behaves this way. Boundary destroyers don't follow those rules, and they often don't reciprocate honesty and fairness. They are concerned with their own interests, not mutuality. To have healthy relationships with people who are honest and care genuinely for him, Marcus will need to develop a healthier relationship to his anger and his boundaries. Doing so will help him sense unsafe people and steer clear of them, and he can learn to have a sense of reasonable caution in between extreme guardedness and being naively overtrusting. On the other hand, Marcus's openness to others, his sense of what it means to be moral and loyal, and his awareness of his anger can serve another purpose in his healing. While he'll need to shift some of these things to be healthier, these traits are all indicators that he's not like his father. The very fact that he worries about the impact he might have on others proves that he is different. Thank you so much. What a beautiful insight. The emotion of anger is crucial for us. Yes, it's the emotion that helps us set boundaries. And this is a topic that will come often in these sessions with Marcus. Marcus's anger helps him clarify what his boundaries are and what he's not okay with. By following the clues of Marcus's body language as he talks about what he calls frustration, I was able to model a healthy anger response to the lying and the betrayal that Marcus experienced. Marcus gets to see the truth of his own feelings reflected in this. And after I say I would be furious in a situation that Marcus described in the session, Marcus admits that it is actually what he feels as well. I explicitly state that anger is really a spectrum, not an either or. There are more options available than either repression or violent rages. Both of these types of reactions are actually two sides of the same coin of unhealthy anger. Empowered anger is the place in the middle of that spectrum, which Marcus has tapped into in this session. Marcus gets a visible burst of energy from his anger after acknowledging being furious, and he channels this energy very differently than what he saw growing up. Rather than acting out his anger, he uses it to propel him towards a new beginning and getting out of the place that he's currently living in. In doing this, Marcus has actually already taken the first steps towards breaking the cycle that he's been repeating. Marcus is considerably lighter emotionally towards the end of the session. He has a more vibrant look on his face and he's energized as he starts to plan how he can get a home of his own and leave his current place without legal and financial repercussions. This is his rite of passage to signify that he's done with perpetually feeling homeless, to be preceded by his funeral ritual. Marcus's idea of having his sons participate in the funeral ritual marks another important indicator of cycle breaking. Not only is Marcus fully feeling and grieving loss as a part of moving forward, he's now also modeling this healthy emotional process to his children. Marcus is a completely different person than his father, and he's putting a lot of effort into intentionally creating a new legacy for his own family. Let me highlight something about Marcus being more energized towards the end of the session, even though we were talking about some quite heavy material almost the entire time. This is the power of naming. It's not that I provided Marcus with a listening ear exclusively so that we could talk about what was on his mind and on his heart. Very much like naming the emotion in the case of the emotional release recipe. Naming his loss with some precision, naming it exactly, and putting his finger on what exactly has been lost has a huge therapeutic effect. In other words, naming the loss or the losses in their specificity is what actually facilitates the release of grief. One of the typical student challenges that comes up with this study is students worrying that they would not be able to give Marcus legal advice. Here's how one of our students put it. Something that I thought could be a challenge in this session for me was helping Marcus sort through his options regarding the legal issues with leaving his current home. I've only ever rented apartments, and I feel like a bit of a fish out of water in discussion about mortgages and splitting up with someone you're legally married to. It reminded me of a coaching session I did years ago where the client just found out she was pregnant and she was very overwhelmed and scared about how her life would change. This is also not something I have any experience with, and I feel somewhat insecure in these instances. Even though I helped this client just fine, I was worried about saying the wrong thing, and I would be nervous about feeling the same way with Marcus. Let me highlight here that it wasn't my background in law that helped me in this session. Number one, I don't remember ever taking a course on real estate law or something like that. I also got my law degree in Slovakia, which means that I only studied Slovak law, and hence my degree isn't much of help anywhere else. But what did help was just knowing how mortgages work. If you've never taken on a mortgage, then at least someone in your life did. Perhaps just get a very simple understanding on how mortgages work. I guess the bottom line is that there are certain life topics, certain real life topics that are fairly common. For example, many people take a mortgage to be able to buy a property, or many people divorce and then they have to divide up that property. So I really had just a relatively basic common sense understanding. And I didn't know how things work in Australia, so I simply asked Marcus questions. My goal wasn't to give him legal advice. My goal was to understand his situation well enough so that I could help him figure out what the next best course of action was. So, if there are areas that you're not so familiar with, know that you're not required to give expert advice. You just need enough information to understand where your client's at, to understand the gist of their challenge, and to be able to guide them with the next step. And that next step could be which lawyer can you talk to about this? That's exactly what happened in this session. We agreed that Marcus would speak with his friend Edita, who could assist him for free. Let me wrap up with one more student challenge that sometimes comes up with this case study. One of our students said, "It definitely could be a challenge for me that Marcus and I have similarities in how we grew up, with an alcoholic, abusive, and violent father. When Professor Isabella read his therapeutic letter, I got emotional because I can completely feel and understand his pain and his words. They resonate a lot with me. So it could be a challenge because his traumas are so familiar to me, which could lead me to get emotional and maybe not have enough distance to what he's telling me. It feels like it could be challenging to find the right balance of emphasizing but still keeping a neutral position and not getting affected myself. The solution that this student presented is absolutely right, and it's one that I try to bring up in most of these answer keys. The student said, "I will overcome this with my own healing. Once my own healing is complete, or at least the topics around my father, I probably will not get triggered by it anymore. It will still touch me, but I will find it easier to not get too emotionally involved and affected." Let me add one thing to this. Sometimes it's difficult to just list your traumas. It's not always as straightforward as looking back and chronologically listing all the traumatic memories that you can remember. Sometimes what needs to happen is to allow life flow and then show you exactly where some healing is still needed. This is being done that much more easier for you as you go through the GTR case studies. There's such a great selection of the different traumatic situations and topics that tend to show up most often. There's a very high likelihood that you will find where your healing is needed as you are going through these case studies. For the student in question, it was growing up in a household where there was an alcoholic, abusive, and violent father. With some of the other case studies, it might be a breakup that still isn't completely healed in you, or perhaps a suicide that happened with a loved one, and you still feel frozen when you're watching some of the case studies where suicide is brought up. Take this opportunity to identify where your own healing is still needed, and then use the GTR tools to get yourself to a healed enough place that you can show up for your clients in a very pure and supportive state. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure bringing you another one of these answer keys, and I'll connect with you again very soon. Bye for now.